cutting off users from Internet access regardless of the justification provided, including on the grounds of violating intellectual property rights law, to be disproportionate and thus a violation of Article 19, Paragraph 3 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That was a June 2011 UN report declaring Internet access a human right. And I bet you feel that way, Internet, that you are a human right, that everybody ought to be able to have you all the time. So what's the problem with the United Nations saying that people should be able to get on the Internet? We love the Internet, right? Well, FCC Commissioner Robert McDowell is back with us, just returned from Spain, where he's been talking about this very subject in the United Nations. And Fred Barnes has gamely agreed to stay with us as we try to sort out matters way beyond the ken of a couple of political hacks. So tell us what's going on, Commissioner.
So we are in the midst of a treaty renegotiation process. The last treaty was negotiated in 1988, and that sort of insulated the Internet from regulation, liberalized in the classical liberal sense, telecoms regulation throughout the world, and really set up the path, the course of history that allowed the Internet to flourish the way it has in an unregulated way.
And so this was before there was an Internet, really?
Really, yeah, essentially. Back in '88, it was like computer-to-computer conversations, machine-to-machine, and that later became the Internet.
Right.
So what we now have is a series of meetings throughout the globe between now and December. In December, these meetings will culminate in a big treaty renegotiation in Dubai. And you will have all 193 countries represented in something called the International Telecommunication Union, basically an arm of the UN, redrafting this treaty. And you've had folks like Vladimir Putin come out and say, quote, we should have international control of the Internet through the ITU, end quote. And I take him seriously.
Yeah, well, you better take him seriously. He just won 66% of the vote or something in Russia.
All legitimately.
Not that there was anything wrong with any of that. Not that any of that was in any way questionable. In case the NKVD is around. But anyway, Fred, this is an issue that has sort of crossed political lines to a certain extent, because the Internet has become the mother's milk of American politics on both sides, and free expression. And while many liberals say that it's important to have the UN protect access for people in places like, Syria, that there is some concern that anytime the Internet gets regulated, is this a legitimate political hot button?
Well, I think so, and my view is anything that the United Nations gets into is something they probably shouldn't, and even if they do, will not do well. I mean, although I remember back some years ago when I was growing up, and we used to celebrate UN Day in American schools.
One world.
Yeah, we haven't done that in a long time, but let me ask Commissioner McDowell this. What will the UN get out of this?
Well, I think look for proposals that seem innocuous and small at first. So there's going to be a big line crossed, and that will be from the UN not regulating the Internet to it having jurisdiction over the Internet, but for maybe beneficent reasons that will be advertised. Now, what a lot of foreign phone companies want to do is to charge websites money for the traffic that's downloaded onto those networks. That will really, sort of like raising taxes, actually it will decrease the revenue that flows to them, because a lot of big websites, probably like a Google or a Facebook or whatever, will just pull out of those countries.
Right.
But that would just be the first stage of an incremental...
So is this like, I'm sorry to interrupt, but is this like an international version of net neutrality, basically, the discussion that we've had here, where you're talking about how to regulate the commercial flow, but it actually could have an effect, could impinge on the freedoms of the Internet?
It's actually even bigger than that, because first of all, it would be the ITU, this arm of the UN, and it could involve cybersecurity and privacy. It could involve regulating engineering standards that are now done by non-governmental groups of engineers and not international bureaucrats.
What's the right answer? Status quo, or what should the solution be?
Well, essentially status quo, something we call the multi-stakeholder process of non-governmental groups getting together to figure out how the Internet works and keeping it robust. Now, if we need to expand that umbrella to include the ITU, to give them an advisory role along with all the other stakeholders, that's fine. I've proposed that in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago. But you do not want an international regulatory overlay that would be devastating to free trade and free expression throughout the world.
Yeah, who wants that other than Putin? I mean, there are other countries.
Well, sure. There could be up to 90 countries by some counts, and I've been talking to a lot of non-governmental groups like the Internet Society that do these things. So certainly Russia and China are big into this, especially in cybersecurity. And one of the motivations I've heard some explain to me is that for cybersecurity, they want to have an international treaty through the ITU, so the U.S. lives by one standard, and they breach the treaty, just the way we saw with the START treaty.
Yes, we've seen that movie on other things. Yeah. Charles Reese says internet access is not a human right; it is a privilege, just like most things are in this world. Only a socialist would come up with something so absurd. And Bobby Hawkins makes a good point that freedom is so important to the internet because it's been a leveling effect, and he says it needs to be kept that way so the little guy can compete. How likely I read an article today, basically the Obama administration through the Commerce Department poo-pooing this notion and in a way rebutting your Wall Street Journal op-ed and saying, oh, this is not an area of concern, this is not a big deal, we can handle this. What are your answers to those blame?
I think some of the diplomats, State Department takes the lead. So State Department diplomats have to say some things publicly that they can't say privately. So there's public diplomacy and private diplomacy. And I think that's a lot of what you're seeing right now. I think there's a great deal of concern. The Obama administration and I are substantively on the same page here. I do wish they would appoint a head of delegation for this treaty, which they haven't done yet. But thus far, it's being run by a fellow named Phil Revere, our roving ambassador for telecoms, who's an old friend, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for him, and I think he's very competent. But I want to make sure that not just our government, but governments throughout the world, as well as industry, really understand the severity of this effort this time is unlike any other time in Internet history.
Commissioner, you're very kind to make time for us. Fred Barnes, as always, we are in your debt. We stand in your debt. Now, Internet, I have bad news for you, other than that Vladimir Putin may take you over. But Jonathan Hunt's off today. But there's good news. Juliette Huddy is in for him, and she will be guiding you through the next hour here on the Fake Television. You will enjoy it a great deal, I promise you. I will be back with you tomorrow starting at 11 o'clock from the mothership in New York. I'm going to break down everything on Super Tuesday. I'm going to be on the big board. It's going to be awesome. Don't tell Hemmer. We're going to have all of that and more. And pray God, a word from Charles. So we'll have all that for you. So make sure you join us tomorrow.